we do not have access to broadband in certain areas. And I think part of the reason I can say personally why this is important, I used to be among that demographic that didn't have broadband at my home. I was the parent who took my kid to Wendy's parking lot to help him with some of his homework, so he had access to Wi-Fi broadband to do some of his work. So I can relate to the folks that don't have it. I feel fortunate now that I do have it at my home, and I have it here at work, so that I can do things that we're doing right here and now. But there's so many that struggle with it, and I think that's a lot of it, why we've stayed involved in it. And then we had the opportunity, the Economic Development Administration, under the U.S. Department of Commerce, they provided us funding during the coronavirus pandemic here. And one of the things we said was we wanted to do a study and try to begin implementation of projects in our region related to broadband. So we did a competitive RFP. As I recall, we had 8 proposals submitted, which we reviewed and scored. And Reid Consulting Group came out on top of that scoring. And we signed a contract with them. If I recall right, Tom, it was about December of 2020 when we did that. And they've been on board since. And the information they've put together has been all the things they've done since then on contract with us. So without saying too much more, that just gives you a background of what our involvement's been, why we're here today, why Reid Consulting Group's doing this. They are on contract with us to look at our region. And again, this is for your benefit, our benefit as well, to look at what the situation is, what are some strategies for moving forward. So at that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom Reid with the Reid Consulting Group, and Tom's going to take us from here. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Really appreciate the introduction, and you made some good points about the fact that we have made good progress, particularly in serving healthcare, libraries, and schools with all those middle mile projects. But when we re-engaged on this project, realized that the last mile piece, getting to the residential and small business folks, we still have a long ways to go there. And so that's the really important topic here. And while we're doing a study, everything we do, and this really fits in well with OVRDC's mission, we don't want to just study it and put it on a shelf. We want to turn it into concrete action. So as you'll see in the presentation, we'll explain that process. Joining me today for handling questions and answer and maybe some of the presentation is Sean O'Malley. And then Peter Voderberg is also on the line, and I think we're just going to interweave Peter into the conversation in a couple of different locations. I don't know how many of you know Peter. He's the head of BroadbandOhio. I've just been amazed. The first time I had to go brief Peter, it was up in the Lieutenant Governor's office before BroadbandOhio existed, and I just assumed I was going to be giving kind of the Broadband 101 to a state official. And it turned out, no, we took about 30 seconds to quickly go through all the Broadband 101 conversation and start getting into these really in-depth points that really encouraged me then when Peter was appointed as the Executive Director of BroadbandOhio. And I've just been amazed at what he and his team have been able to accomplish thus far, and very hopeful for the future. And there's Peter on the screen now. You want to say a couple of opening words, Peter?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I do that all the time, where I say good morning instead of afternoon, and vice versa. Just happy to be here. Really excited to see the presentation and to be a part of it. And so I'll let you take it away.
All right. Well, let me share my screen here, and I'll try not to do death by PowerPoint. But as I mentioned, my name's Tom Reid, and Sean O'Malley is also with us. And so OVRDC got this process going. The other regional councils joined in. And then we've also been working with BroadbandOhio and InnovateOhio. And all of this sort of coalesced into this concept of Connecting Appalachia. So everybody agreed, well, we'll just use the Connecting Appalachia banner as a way to describe the work of all these various groups. And then other entities also joined in the effort. So we've got a lot of sources of potential funding, as well as advocates and folks helping us craft the solutions. So really what we're trying to do is position our region for the win. And I've had to use the Bengals because holy cow, they're in the Super Bowl. And I'm in Athens, Ohio, so Joe Burrow's hometown. So yeah, obviously we feel pretty strongly about that one. But to win this broadband issue, first we need to identify and prioritize. Where do we still have gaps? And as you'll see, a lot of areas. And then determine specifications and what it'll cost to build to those specifications. And then we need to fund it, and we need to track it, and we need to enforce that it actually happens. So just a couple of primers for anybody who needs it, and I'll go through this quickly. So in these speeds, you'll see the nomenclature of 1 Mbps, which is 1 million bits per second, 1 megabit per second. And then the other is 1 Gbps, 1 gigabit per second, which is 1 billion bits per second. When the download speed from the internet is higher than the upload speed, that's considered asymmetric. So you hear these asymmetric and symmetric terms a lot. So for instance, in asymmetric, it might be 25 megabits down, 3 megabits up, so forth. And then if the speeds are the same, the upload and download speeds are the same, it's called symmetric. So using those same speed tiers, instead of 25.3, it'd be 25.25 or 100.100 and so forth. So the underlying infrastructure, telecommunications in rural America has depended on twisted pair copper. It's done a great job for us. It's just gotten too old. But that's when we talk about twisted pair or the copper cables, that's what we're talking about. The cable companies started installing coaxial cables probably 20 years ago. And that's where most people get their internet services today, is through cable modem services. And it offers pretty high speeds. But in terms of reaching out to the future, most people are looking to fiber optics, which is really thin strands of glass because of the capacity and longevity. So we've been working on mapping broadband for quite a while, and we've used multiple sources of data from the FCC, from the Universal Service Administration Company. We use 911 data, census data, Department of Transportation data. But the real big game changer in the latest iteration of mapping came because Innovate Ohio licensed this data from a private company called Ookla. And if you ever Google speed test, because you want to take a speed test, it almost always ends up that you're at Ookla's site and you're using Ookla's speed test tools. Well, Innovate Ohio licensed that. BroadbandOhio gave us access to it as the Connecting Appalachia group, and that really changed the game in terms of being able to identify where broadband is and broadband isn't. So statewide, it's a pretty startling picture. So the deep red there are areas where you can't get even 10.1, 10 megabits down, 1 megabit up. And then the orange areas, you can get 10.1, but you can't get 25.3. And so forth. So you'll see that deepest green is 100 by 20, which is the current federal standard that we're trying to achieve. And there are not very many areas in Ohio that achieve that speed. So on the current federal definitions, that red and orange are considered unserved. And then the yellow and light green are considered underserved. And you have to be 100 by 20 to be considered served. So this is all based on over 9 million consumer-initiated speed tests on the Ookla platform. And so we really encourage that people continue to take these speed tests. We have a simple way to do it, an explanation at the Connecting Appalachia website. We really could use more data to make sure that we're even have a higher level of accuracy. And when we look at it numerically, it's pretty stunning. It's 65% of the populated geography in the state of Ohio can't get 25.3, and that's about 800,000 homes. We compare that to the FCC, where they map it just based on what carriers say is available. They say it's about 200,000 households right now. Now they are redoing those maps, so hopefully they'll be a lot more accurate. But in the last mapping round, they were saying there were about 200,000 households that were unserved. We're saying it's more like 800,000. But we're not way outliers on this. Microsoft says there's more like 2 million homes in Ohio. So we think it's 4 times worse. Microsoft thinks it's 10 times worse. So we're kind of in the middle there, for whatever comfort you draw from that. So when we look at the OVRDC counties, it's a lot of red. There's a lot of red there. And that accounts for 69% of the populated geography and 26% of the households. So in the OVRDC territory, we're talking about over 76,000 households that can't get 25.3. And if you're like me, you're going, how is that possible? How can we be in that state? Because this goal of achieving universal service dates all the way back to 1934. This idea of helping rural America keep up in the telecommunications infrastructure dates all the way back to 1934, when they said quite clearly, all people in the United States shall have access to rapid, efficient, nationwide communication service with adequate facilities at reasonable costs. And we achieved that with telephone service. But unfortunately, since 1990, the FCC has spent $100 billion to try to solve this problem, but due to a lack of specifications, it has not achieved the goals. Basically, think about if you just stopped doing highway maintenance. You'd start out with big potholes, and a few decades later, you'd have a goat path. And unfortunately, that's the situation we have in a lot of our areas, is that the old copper cables that were installed 50 plus years ago, and they did a great job providing our telephone services. They are not adequate now for providing broadband because they're just past end of life. So part of this problem is that there's been a lack of specifications. So imagine you're building a highway. Well, there's a very detailed set of specifications that go along with that about the different levels, the different layers of that, what that has to be, how thick they have to be, and so forth. Very detailed specifications. Broadband, though, has not had those sort of specifications. It's mostly just relied on speed targets. Hey, you have to provide 25.3. Nothing about the infrastructure to do that. And so that's allowed the infrastructure just to be neglected. It's really important that we think about this as an infrastructure project, because that's really what it is. If you look back in time, about 1990 is when the World Wide Web started. So the internet started back in the late 60s, early 70s, but it really became a popular consumer topic in the 1990s when the World Wide Web became a way to access all that information. Then we have VoIP, and now we have Zoom. And so over those 3 decades, there was a 10-fold increase in demand from decade to decade. So each decade going up 10-fold. So 25.3, that measurement we use now to say whether an area is unserved, that was really relevant about 10 years ago. Today, the average speed in well-served areas is 100 megabits per second. So what's the future going to hold in terms of network utilization? Yeah, who knows? I mean, telehealth, obviously, we're going to do augmented reality. I wouldn't doubt that the progress is going to continue apace. But if you project that out, then that means that we're at 1 gigabit per second by 2030, 10 gigabits per second by 2040, and all the way up to 100 gigabits per second by 2050. Now, anytime you take a trend chart like that and extrapolate it out, you have questionable results. But certainly the 1 gigabit makes sense. 1 gigabit's already very prevalent in a lot of well-served areas. So 10 gigabits seems entirely reasonable too. We need to think about this long-term, because we don't want to keep installing, here's a solution in the last 5 years. 10 years later, we're going, oh, we don't have good enough internet again. We need to redo it all over again. I don't think any of us want to be in that situation. So when we look at what technologies can serve these needs, DSL, fixed wireless, satellite, generally top out at about 100 megabits per second, the average speed today. Cable modem right now is topping out about 1 gigabit per second. There's some developments there that may help it go faster. But if you're talking about what's available today, fiber is the only solution that can reach this 100 gigabit kind of speed. And there's a lot, it sounds like tremendous speed, but there's a lot of 100 gigabit links in network backbones these days, even faster than that. So when we look at our planning horizon, 2025 to 2055, a 30-year planning horizon, we need to think about solutions to solve that entire period of time. So in 2055, we still have something that we want. If you're opening a package, it'd be great if you'd mute. And then it certainly makes sense to also pursue short-term efforts. Between now and the time we can get the final solution, and I'm saying it's fiber just because it's the technology that can do it right now at these highest speeds. The short-term solutions are also really important. There's been a number of efforts to expand wireless internet services to people on existing vertical infrastructure, on existing tower, or existing silo. These are really good because it's going to take time to build this all out. So I love the idea of being technology neutral, but you can't sacrifice the needs and specifications of the long term to achieve technology neutrality. So fiber is really powerful. Single mode fiber, which is mostly what's deployed, is thinner than a hair. Lasers are used to transmit on it over very long distances. 1 billion bits per second to the home is the minimum you can do with fiber. You can't even buy electronics that are slower than that. You could throttle people down and say you only get 100 megabits per second electronically, but that equipment's able to do 1 gigabit per second. Then your neighborhood is probably supported at 10 gig, across the county at 100 gig. It's just a tremendous amount of capacity by changing out the electronics. So when we looked at 25 megabits versus 1 gigabits, it's 40 times the capacity. So we've got some cost projections I want to explain to you. And the bottom line here is not all fiber is created equal. That look into various aspects, make ready on utility poles, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Very wide range in the cost of make ready on utility poles. We're seeing ranges of $30,000 to $60,000 in the budgets that we're going to provide each county to solve their problems. We used a number of $41,000. And then the fiber and the construction, we came up with a range of $32,000 to $40,000 based on a specific set of specifications that we want met. So you end up with between $64,000 and $100,000 per mile to construct these networks. And again, we're shooting for a 40-year life out of these networks. That's why it's probably more expensive than some of the numbers you've heard before. We projected it then at $81,000 a mile to average these options. But this is based on a high strand count design, meaning that instead of like putting in a 48 strand fiber, we're saying you put in a 288 strand fiber, high strand count. No one has ever come back later and said, I wish we hadn't installed so much fiber. There are needs and requirements that are going to continue to emerge over a 30 or 40-year lifetime that you're never going to be sorry to have extra strands. So the method we use to determine how many strands need to go into an area is minimum of 1 dedicated strand per household, sufficient strands to support mobile and 5G services, and also to support smart grid innovations for our electrical services, and then a minimum of 50% spare capacity to handle future requirements based on economic development, increased housing. Hopefully we reverse some of our population declines in these areas by providing good broadband. And then it's an armored cable and installed based on existing USDA rural utility services specifications. So we don't have to create these. RUS has already created hundreds and hundreds of pages of specifications about installation of fiber cables. And then also that the electrical infrastructure is deployed based on the National Electric Safety Code specifications. So this make ready concept, it confuses a lot of folks that in Appalachian, Ohio, most of the fiber gets installed on existing utility poles because you might want to go underground, but we have a lot of rock close to the surface in Appalachian, Ohio. So most people just plan it to be aerial. on existing utility poles. And so if you're not familiar with the utility industry, and I've become a lot more familiar with it through this process, the primary lines up high, the secondary lines are also power. Then you have drops to homes, and then you see those communications lines. There can be some existing communications lines like from your telephone company. And so if you want to install fiber on those, you're going to go below those existing communications lines, and there's a minimum clearance you have to meet with the ground. And so in a flat land area, pretty good chance that you can attach a fiber line underneath the existing communications line and still have that minimum clearance. But in our beautiful area with all the hills, you end up with that minimum clearance not being maintained. And so you end up replacing poles with taller poles so you can achieve that minimum clearance. So that's what we talk about when we talk about make ready, is it's mostly pole replacements to deal with clearance. Some of it's just because the pole has gotten old and no longer can offer structural integrity. So we've got profiles almost done for every county in the OVRDC territory, but I'll step through one county to explain how we got to this point. So looking at Jackson County, these are speed test locations around the county. This was over a 15-month period that we analyzed the data, and you'll see a mixture of colors. You see some green dots and yellow dots in here. Areas with only red and orange dots. So the red and orange dots are the slowest speeds. The green dots are the highest speeds. And so we do that and then chart that into census blocks so we can grade individual census blocks. So you'll see there's some parts of Jackson County, we've got some dark green in little parts of Jackson County, but most of Jackson County really needs a lot of attention. It's 86% of the populated area, and almost half of the households are below 25.3. So when we look at it, this change in color, we're showing just the areas that are below 25.3. And the little black dots are the households according to the E911 data. So it's a little over 11,000 households that fall into that area. Then when we say, well, let's look at the roads in those unserved areas, it tells us that we need probably 821 miles of fiber in that area, and that's 9.6 households per fiber mile. So we take that cost formula we talked about, $81,000 a mile, and we realize the total cost in that area is $73 million. That includes the 821 miles of fiber plus the cost to provide drops to people's homes. We expect private investment of about 14 million, and so a funding gap of about 59 million to do this long-term solution in Jackson County. So there are a lot of funding programs from showing you half a dozen different agencies here with funding programs, and each of them have more than one. And Peter, I thought this might be a great time for you to weigh in if you're interested to talk about these funding programs a little bit.
Sure, I'll talk about three really quickly. The three that are probably the most pertinent to today from the state's perspective. The first one is the Residential Grant Program. Basically, what the Ohio Residential Grant Program does, it's actually the Ohio Residential Broadband Expansion Grant, or ORBAG, as we like to call it. It allows for companies to apply for grants. It is for any area that suffers from coverage of 25.3 or less, and an internet service provider can come in and apply for that area to be able to run internet connectivity to the houses in those areas. It is done on an as-addressed basis. It is not done by census block. And basically, we have a whole bunch of applications in. We have over 200 applications in. We are currently in our challenge process, but we are hoping to be able to award grants out by March of this year. So we're very much looking forward to that. The next thing I want to talk a little bit about is the Treasury Capital Projects Fund, or the Coronavirus Capital Projects Fund. Basically, it is another $269-ish million that is being established for broadband expansion through the Department of the Treasury. The state of Ohio has already applied for the money. It is a non-competitive grant, so basically we have already said that we would like to have the money. Right now, a plan is being worked out from the state perspective on how to be able to use that money for broadband expansion. A lot of the focus of those funds is on broadband expansion and how it can help if there is another pandemic type of situation. And the last one is the Broadband Infrastructure Program and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the IIJA. And basically there are multiple components in that. There is a broadband program for infrastructure, which includes a planning phase and then an implementation phase. There is a digital equity program phase as well, where we do a planning phase, an implementation phase, and then a competitive grant phase. And then there is a middle mile infrastructure phase, and that's the kind of internet that goes from not from your house to anywhere, but from where your house terminates. It takes it from there to the greater internet, to the servers and the other locations, the points of presence that actually get you out and about to the greater internet. So those are the three things that are coming right now. From a timing perspective, the Ohio Residential Broadband Expansion Grant projects will probably be announced in March. The Coronavirus Capital Projects Funds will likely be announced sometime soon after that. And then the Treasury, or the Broadband Infrastructure Program, once we actually get the information in May from the National Telecommunications Information Administration, we'll know what we can do to apply for those monies by the end of this year. So that's kind of what's going on right now and the timing. And Tom, I will hand it back over to you.
Well, I think we should all really be grateful. There's a lot of states that do not really have broadband offices, and our broadband office, fortunately, is led by a visionary person, because when you look at NTI and Treasury, their programs actually loop back through BroadbandOhio. So NTI has the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, but it will be implemented through BroadbandOhio, and the Treasury Capital Project Fund is implemented through BroadbandOhio. So there's going to be a lot of focus on Peter and his team. So one of the other programs from the FCC, this was actually, and I'll stick with Jackson County, we'll look at the whole region in a minute. It's just kind of easier to understand some of this in a closer space. The FCC Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, Phase 1, boy, that's a mouthful. That auction happened in November of 2020. And it's not too hard to get qualified for the auction, but then there's a whole due diligence phase. And that due diligence phase is still going on. So when you look, for instance, at Jackson County, we've got the dark blue is Charter. The lighter blue is a company called Mercury Wireless. And then the kind of purple is LTD Broadband. And then the rest of that area are areas that were not addressed in RDOF. And anybody who's heard me talk about it before, I've been extremely skeptical of any of these entities' intention to actually deploy, because they bid way down. They only took 20 cents on the dollar in a lot of these areas, in some places even less. But I've got to eat my words here in regards to Charter and Spectrum, Charter Spectrum. They really are implementing. They do share a lot of information. They're having a lot of public discussions and disclosures. So I'm really happy to eat my words to say that it really appears that Charter does intend to deploy in these areas. And we're actually starting to see some of that in some of the counties. So still not sure about Mercury Wireless and LTD Broadband. We do not have any dialogue with them. I don't know anybody in the state that really has a dialogue with them yet. And then if you take the Ohio Residential Broadband Grant Program, I don't know where that's coming from. If you look at the Ohio Residential Broadband Grant Program, so I overlaid that, and I just overlaid Horizon Telecom and Spectrum. So the darker blue dots are places that Horizon Telecom applied for in Jackson County. The yellow dots are areas that Spectrum applied for in Jackson County. There was over 800,000 addresses applied for in House Bill 2. So the good news is there's tremendous interest in solving this problem amongst the internet service providers. Peter, how's that challenge process going?
It is going really well right now. We have received over 400 distinct challenges, with quite a few addresses. Many of them are duplicates. that we are working through right now, but my staff is doing very well as to going through all of the challenges to review evidence and to make sure that we have the money going to areas that need it, that otherwise do not have build-outs that already exist or won't have build-outs for the next 2 years. So those are the ways that you can challenge. You can either say, I already exist in that area, or I'm about to build out into that area in the next 2 years. And we have some really good challenges, and we are really looking forward to meeting with the authority here towards the middle of February to go over all of the challenges and to get the authority's guidance on which ones to accept and which ones to reject. So we are chugging along every day.
That's great. So we look at the OVRDC counties, the areas below 25.3, and we overlay RDOF on it. You'll see we end up with another company in there next here, as well as Charter, Mercury, and LTD Broadband. And we just have to wait and see. Some of the little fragmented areas for Charter are actually surrounding their existing service areas. But one of the ones that really puzzles me is Mercury Wireless. They have little teeny spots that they won all over the state. I don't understand how anybody builds a network that makes sense that way, but we'll wait and see. So Charter Spectrum just cleared a hurdle of being almost authorized. FCC does this two-step process. So it appears that Charter will be authorized. None of the other awardees in this area have yet been authorized by the FCC. Not quite sure why it's taking them as long as it has, but I'm glad they're doing a good due diligence effort. I would have painted this with all of the grant applications from the Ohio Residential Broadband Grant Program, but then you can't see the map. There are just so many applications. So again, really good news that we have a lot of interest from the private industry to try to solve this broadband issue. I just want to mention, we will continue to update these maps. So for instance, if next tier drops out, we'll take next tier off the map. If Peter makes some awards, we'll put Peter's awards on the maps. So we'll keep updating these maps, try to keep everybody able to see where they still need to focus attention and where we should be able to see progress. And that's the next thing I want to talk about is progress tracking and accountability. It's another reason we want people to engage in the speed testing process on an ongoing basis. I'm not saying you have to do it twice a day, but once a week would be great, because we can see an area that has terrible broadband, as you see in the left here, where it's all just dark colored dots with low speeds. And so that might get awarded. Peter might award that area. Well, then we should be able to see it. When an internet service provider says the south half of that award area is finished, we should be able to see it in the speed tests, that now we see some green dots in there as well. And then when they report to us they've done the entire project, again, we should be able to see that. And it's not that the whole thing will turn green, because there'll still be some connection issues and things like that that cause some lower speed tests, but you can really see the change over time. And so we're excited about this ability to track it. We're doing some testing with Spectrum, Horizon, and Point have all shared with us information about where they've deployed recently, so we can test our methodology for tracking progress. And then really important, I would love to see all these programs require verification and inspection before we release payments. I don't know what's going to happen, but it's something I think would be really, really helpful, is to make sure that the progress has happened before you release the next payment to an awardee. So when we look at the whole state, going back to that big picture, wow, it's probably a $3 billion problem, and probably need a couple $2 billion in subsidy to solve the whole thing. And it sounds crazy, but when you compare it to highway construction, it's like building 100 to 150 miles of highway. Well, that doesn't even go from Columbus to the eastern edge of the state. So we've built highways here before, and other types of infrastructure. We can solve this problem too. And we just need to keep in mind that it is an infrastructure issue that we need to solve here, not just achieving some minimal speeds. And it's also comparable to money that's been spent before. I mentioned early on that there was $100 billion spent from 1990 to 2020. And It just wasn't invested well. So we need to make sure to spend the money wisely as we move forward. So I really think for rural America, it's a fight for our future, that we've all seen a lot of our communities kind of get hollowed out, and drug issues take over a lot of our areas. Well, there's a lot of opportunity available based on having broadband access and the skills necessary to utilize them. A lot of jobs. I've worked from my home for over a decade. And so it's a huge issue, because we want our areas to be vibrant, engaged, and productive. We know they can be. High quality of life available here, much lower housing costs. We think there's a real opportunity to keep people here, bring people here, and help the people who are here have a better life. It's been really clearly established that when you bring broadband into an area, it increases productivity, it increases average household income, so we're going to lift a lot of households out of poverty, and that it increases tax revenues. As the economy picks up, the various levels of government benefit from that. So really, the cost, as high as it seems, the cost to solve this problem will be paid back in 7 years or less in increased tax revenues. So it's really a win-win, and I'm really looking forward to seeing our first few counties that end up going wall-to-wall fiber to the home. I think it'll be really exciting and help prove this case out. You can help us. We've got a survey at the Connecting Appalachia website. Taking that survey would be really helpful. If you're one of those folks that can't get broadband at home, or people can't get broadband at home, please go to the library or any place else you can get access to take that survey. And then any level of internet that you have, we'd really like you to perform the speed test, even if you've got great service. The speed test helps inform us that great service is there. Minford Telephone Company is an example. We've been working with them because they feel like we graded some of their areas too harshly. And great, we want to see the speed test, because if that broadband really is there, we want to know it. We want to be able to show it in the map. So having people perform the speed tests, and any providers here, please send your subscribers to Connecting Appalachia. If you think you've got great broadband and you want to prove it, send them to Connecting Appalachia to take that speed test. And then help us just talk about these common sense ways of addressing it. So again, that's connectingappalachia.org. So Sean, did you want to share what that is going to look like, the profiles we're sending out?
Sure. Yeah, I've got an example of it. We're working on them right now. So I've just got one that's a mock-up actually from a county in a neighboring development district. It's Muskingum. That just happened to be the one that we were doing all of our final proofing on. But this will show you what these look like. I'm betting there's some county commissioners in here. I've probably presented the first version of these profiles to you at one of your meetings. This one is significantly more detailed. So I will go ahead and share the screen of this. It's got maps, significantly more maps than we had before. There we go. Okay, you all should be seeing Muskingum County. We've got the color coding here. Similar to what Tom showed in his presentation, the dark red is below 10.1, the orange is below 25.3, and then we just went ahead and did a single green color for anything that was faster than 25.3, because the map on this size of a document starts to get really confusing when you have all those gradations. And there's a few census blocks you'll see that are gray. That's where we either didn't have any data or there's nobody living there. So there was no reason to rate that. These percentages and numbers of households will be available for each county. Second map we have is what we call business opportunity areas. Here we took Dun and Bradstreet information. So we've got data for that for all the Appalachian counties that show where businesses are located, how many employees they have, what industry sector they're in. And then we plotted that on a map, and we adjusted the size of the dot for each of those businesses based on how much demand we thought there would be for broadband there. So the more employees you have, the more demand you're going to have. Also, the sector you're in is going to matter. If you're a construction contractor, you've got 50 employees, probably 48 of those employees are out in the field all day working on projects. So they don't need much broadband at where their business is located. But on the other hand, if you're a IT shop or you're a medical clinic that's got 50 employees, you're gonna have people walking around with tablets doing like taking charts and things and communicating with servers constantly, doing cloud storage. So there's gonna be a lot more broadband demand there, even though it's the same number of employees. So we took that into account.
That construction company still needs good broadband.
Yes,
they just wouldn't need as much.
Yeah, so it's like essentially we don't want to not include anyone. So like every business plotted there, but it's just like some businesses will need more than others, but they all need it. And every county, you're going to end up with these areas like in Muskingum, you'll see up here in the northeastern quadrant and northwestern as well. You've got a fair number of businesses, some of them with pretty good demand profiles, and they're sitting in unserved locations. So this can be a way to make a case for getting providers to come in or make it more attractive to a provider because they're like, well, we could sell business service as well as residential. Then we also provide a map for residential to give you a sense of where your population is laid out. We can't show every single household, of course. Muskingum's got 40,000 households nearly. But we were able to come up with a way of plotting these things so that you do have a pretty good heat map of it without it being just a heat map, because then things kind of blur out. So you can kind of follow the roads. Usually the population follows the roads, even if you can't see the roads. But again, you can kind of get a visual sense for where the density is greater and where the need is. And like in these two cases, they are overlapping with where the businesses are that do not have access as well. Tom showed a version of this for Jackson. We map out where all the roads are that are passing through areas that don't have 25/3 service. And the reason we do this is because that's how you can figure out how much fiber you're going to need or how much infrastructure is going to have to be run and where.
Yeah, road miles are considered a pretty good approximation of fiber miles.
Yeah, because that's where all the utility corridors are, other than like the big transmission corridors. And you're not going to be hanging fiber from a 300-foot tall tower. You're going to be putting it on the little poles that serve all the houses, because that's how you got to get the drops to them. We then do a quick summary of the cost numbers that Tom talked about. So you've got the total cost that we project for the county, how many households that would pass. And when I say pass, I've learned the folks that aren't used to the broadband industry wonder, well, like, does pass mean you're skipping it? It's like, no, pass means you're running it, you're going past it on the road. So that if they want to get service, all they have to do is tell whichever provider's operating there, hey, we want to order service, and then they run a drop line and you're connected. Kind of like having a water line. Water line passes your house, and then you can choose to connect it to it or not. If there isn't something going past your house, you can't get access. We have the projected investment that we would expect internet providers to be willing to kick in. That runs between $1,000 and $2,500 a household, depending on other factors like the density along the roads, things like that. Then we have the funding gap for the county, how much fiber it's going to take, how much grant we think it is. And as Tom mentioned, this is all based on a 40-year solution. You can do this stuff cheaper, but it's like, there's a difference between inexpensive and cheap. You run the risk of cheaping out if you use, for example, household drop fiber, which has just a few strands. It's really lightweight. You can hang it on the poles sometimes without having to upgrade them, but it's going to run out of capacity pretty quickly, especially if you have people moving back to the region or new houses being constructed. So that's why our numbers in here, we all focus on something that will last for multiple decades. We include an RDOF map here so you can see where that coverage is. And again, as this changes, we will update this. Or like as BroadbandOhio starts doing their residential grant application awards, we can start laying those overlays onto these counties as well. Then we get into the nitty gritties. We don't expect everyone's going to read these next sections, but we did want to provide all of the detail of how we came up with the maps, how we color coded things, how we came up with the broadband opportunity index. So like here's a table showing the different sectors and the way we rated them for their broadband demand. We also have details on how we came up with those estimates for the cost of the distances, to give a sense for what it costs to get the poles ready, what it would cost if you did want to do an underground alternative. And again, not all underground alternatives are created the same. You can plow like directly buried like drop cables into the ground like 6 or 8 inches deep. That's not real expensive, but every time somebody goes to put a mailbox in, there's a chance they're going to cut that fiber and the whole neighborhood's going to be taken out. Or again, it won't have a lot of capacity. So again, the numbers we look at, we're like, if you're going to put it in the ground, put it in conduit and have plenty of capacity in there. So that drives the price up for that. Have that information that Tom showed about the demand going up over the next 3 to 4 decades and what that's going to look like. And then finally, we have that same budget page, but we did it just with the placeholders to show, here's the math we did. So, you know, we do sum of make ready plus cost to pass. Here's how we calculated the gap, just so that folks could again see how the math was put together.
And we are going to add a Rural Digital Opportunity Fund page as well to show where the RDOF awards are. Oh,
Yep,
already
this
did
one.
that. Oh, okay,
Yep.
sorry. Thanks, Sean.
You're welcome.
So I think at this point, Peter, other comments, did you have any slides you wanted to present?
No, not for today. I think the only thing I want to bring up to everybody is, you know, Broadband Ohio is always looking to continue to create shovel-ready projects all throughout the state. You know, we are not just a grant giving office. We do a lot of programmatics. We have a telehealth initiative in Monroe County. We have the Muskegon Valley Educational Service Center pilot project, which includes 6 different counties. We have a rural school district that is expanding out into the local region. In Riverside, which is in Logan County, we're doing the same pilot project in East Cleveland. We're doing a similar pilot project in Middletown, which is a suburban community. We did a SpaceX pilot project. So we are always looking to see how we can map out things in the state of Ohio. So from our perspective, one of the greatest things that can be done is to continue to work together to identify these shovel-ready projects, because as project funds become available, as the Coronavirus Capital Project Fund becomes available, as the IIJA projects become available, as all these funding streams happen, we want to make sure that we have projects that are ready to go so that we don't have to delay and do feasibility studies or do other things that are necessary to get those projects up and running and off the ground. So the more we can work together to identify where the shovel-ready projects are, the better off we're going to be.
Thanks, appreciate that.
That's all I've got. Sure.
Well, we can open it up to questions at this point. Gina, do we have questions in the chat we need to address? I saw one of the questions there was about fixed wireless in our terrain. And
Yes.
Some of the fixed wireless, the answers in there were good. Some of the fixed wireless, it can be really successful in reaching a percentage of people in a service area. But if you've got rugged terrain, you're just gonna have so many terrain shadows, it becomes really difficult. Again, really great to build out these networks because we can get service quicker in a lot of cases. And it also provides a competitive overlay for the long term, which I'd love to see competition. You know, any of these areas where we end up with a single provider, well, then we're kind of at their mercy. So good thing to have wireless from that perspective as well.
We had 3 questions while the presentation was going. Another question was, does the material of the poles, wood versus metal, have any influence on transmission quality?
Well, that's a good question. Most of the metal poles I've seen have been more transmission sort of poles where they're, you know, carrying higher voltage lines that are feeding areas. I've only mostly seen wood poles, but you know, I'm not sure how that would affect transmission quality. It's a good question.
Another question we had was, should internet providers be regulated as a public utility? In many states, they are not.
Yeah, Val, that's a big question. And it's a question at a national level too. I kind of favor it personally, just because we regulated the telephone companies for quite a while. Well, we still regulate telephone companies for the telephone services they provide. And through my career, there have been some times where having the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio at your side been really helpful in dealing with, very large companies. So yeah, I think it makes sense. The idea was not to regulate internet service providers because we didn't want to constrain deployment of internet services, that we wanted it to be just kind of wild and woolly. But we look at what we're doing in rural areas where we're saying, here's an area, we're awarding this to Charter, or we're awarding this to, another company. No one else is going to build into that area. So they end up, in most cases, with a natural monopoly, at which point it's really helpful to have some level of regulatory effort over them. This is just my opinion. It's not OVRDC's opinion. Definitely just speaking from my own perspective. Peter, do you have a thought on that one?
Yeah, I think, it is a conversation that's going on at the national level. A lot of different states are having conversations about what to do about it. I think, from our perspective right now, we don't have an opinion on the utilization of declaring internet service providers a public utility. Right now, we are very focused on working with the internet service providers under the current regulations to get them the resources they need to get out to the places that they need to go. So right now, we aren't pursuing regulating anything as a public utility. We're pursuing the grant programs as they're being made available right now to being able to cover the state of Ohio.
Another question coming from Terry Featheroff in Vinton County. She's the Economic Development Director there. What about areas that are very sparsely populated? Will there be a computation of cost per customer if funding is competitive?
Yeah, definitely. Well, one of the things with the BroadbandOhio, the ORBEG, is that it? Did I get it right? ORBEG?
That's ORBEG, yeah, that's right.
One of the key scoring criteria there was match percentage, not cost per household. And I thought that was good because it's saying if you're willing to build into a low population density area, your cost per household may be quite high, but if you come up with enough match, you still score really well. That doesn't solve 100% of the problem for low population density areas. And that's going to be one of the complexities as we look at these various unserved areas, like the map that Sean was showing of Muskingum County. There's that northwest corner of Muskingum County that has a lot of businesses and a lot of people, and it's not served. It's kind of a no-brainer for an ISP to go after that area versus the southeast corner of that county, very sparsely populated. And I know that we have a lot of Vinton County like that. We also have those state parks in Vinton County. We should really be thinking about how do we serve those lodges and those cabins and those vacation properties that are out there, because that has a very big economic impact. So I from what I'm seeing, there's still a good focus on all of the area. And that's one of the things I think is really important right now is some of these federal programs are going to come through and say below 100 by 20 is underserved and is eligible for funding. But as Peter and I have talked about, well, then you're basically talking about the whole state. It's just very few pockets that we've got to keep this focus on these areas that are red, where there's just literally no broadband, and then move up from there in priority.
Any other questions? This is a great time to find out what you want to know. We have the people who know everything about broadband on here.
I did see one that was kind of buried in the middle of the chat. Somebody was asking why do we have to use our phone? Can we use a PC for the speed test? It's complicated. If you want to use a PC for your speed test, it needs to have a GPS chip in it and then install the Ookla speed test app, and then it'll be just as good as a phone. Because the value that we need, like some folks get nervous and they're like, what, you're GPSing me? But like we need to know where within a couple of 100 meters that speed test came from. Otherwise it's not useful for mapping, because when you're on a PC that doesn't have a GPS feature in it, when you run a speed test, it uses the same like third-party location tracking company that like Home Depot uses when you go to their website, and it says, we think you're in Altoona, Pennsylvania. Here's your deals for the day. And depending on your connection, that might be accurate to your neighborhood, or it might put you on the other side of the state.
Yeah, most of the time, if I do a speed test on my home computer, it thinks I'm in St. Clairsville for some reason. 100 miles away from Athens. So yeah, doing it on a mobile device with the app on your Wi-Fi works really well. Again, as Sean said, if you have a GPS chip, like for instance in your laptop, that'll work as well.
Another question came in from Ralph Klein in Lawrence County. How do you see us addressing areas that are sparsely served areas where the large companies take the main road and likely would not take the low density areas? Companies looking to serve the rural get challenged because they need to run fiber through the main road areas.
It's a really good point. And it's one of those issues about accountability and transparency and it's one of my concerns still about the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. Are companies going to cherry pick and say, I'm just not going to go down that road because there's only 3 houses on that road. I realize I said I would, but I'll just take the fine and never go down that road because the fine is a lot cheaper than the cost of going down that road. So that's where the program rules become really important. And what Peter did I have to keep looking at my notes, at OVRDC was to say you have to apply by address. So you're not just going to say, I'm going to serve this area and later say, well, I want to drop half those addresses. You had to apply address by address by address. And I think that's really good because then we can see where those isolated pockets are left and craft a strategy to say, well, what is it going to take to get down those last few roads? So as we keep marking areas off, BroadbandOhio awards several grants, RDOF people actually start building, we can start marking those areas off. And I think pretty clearly, those really low population density areas are going to be the ones that we are going to have to figure out good strategies with. And it really becomes just an issue of more subsidy, less match.
Next question is from Casey Neal. Upcoming FCC required performance testing for speed and latency. How does this go along, or does it go along with the Ookla speed testing to collect the data?
I haven't seen the new FCC process. The old FCC process, it didn't require very many tests. And you could use the standard method, or you could use your own internal network management. I think it's really important that our testing go back to the endpoint, the actual consumer, and say, what is the consumer experiencing rather than what a network operator says the consumer is experiencing. That's what I really like about the Ookla speed test. There are limitations of the Ookla speed testing approach, but then it's just like, well, get us more tests. Because if we see an area that there's nothing in that area that can even reach 10.1 speeds, well, it's not a problem with the testing methodology. It's a problem there's no broadband there. If you look at Athens, you'll see some bad tests, but you see a lot of good tests too. So you can say, well, the preponderance of evidence is Athens is adequately served. But then you go other parts, well, we looked at parts of Jackson County there where it's clear there's no good speeds available. So I really like the fact that it goes back to the consumer than some of the FCC approaches.
We're caught up on our questions in the chat box before last call basically. And I think also John Hemmings, our Executive Director at OVRDC, wanted to say a few words here at the end.
Make sure there's no more questions.
Yeah, raise your hand or just unmute and shout it out. Got something else you want to ask?
I'm not seeing anything. So, well, again, I want to say thank you for everyone taking time out of your afternoon for the presentation. I do want to say that if it wasn't for folks like Tom Reid, Sean O'Malley, and Peter Voderberg, OVRDC would be doing nothing on this because this is not our expertise. But we also know it's a need in our region, and that's why we've worked with Peter's office. We've worked with Tom and Sean more directly through this contract, and it's certainly an important issue in our region. And as you can see, this region of the state has garnered a lot of attention from vendors putting in applications to Peter's office. And Peter, all of those are great applications, just so you know. And
Good to know. Good to know.
Probably the best ones you've received. And but again, this is a very important issue, and I think if we learned anything out of COVID, we've learned that we're not connected, and the importance of being connected in the future. So it's become more prevalent since COVID showed up on the scene. So thank you to everybody. We will certainly probably have future presentations. This project's not done. I think what was been presented here is just where we're at, and I think someone asked about the maps. There will be final maps. Those are not done, as Tom alluded to, for all of our counties, but those will be something we'll share, probably put on our website when the project's finished. So thank you again. Oh, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I'd say we'll probably, I think February for sure. I'm not sure when in February that we'll have it done for every county in the OVRDC territory. And just that we're really honored to be working with you, John and Gina, on behalf of your counties. And, hope we really solve the whole problem this time.
Agreed. And earlier I said that we'd taken the foot off the gas. That was not a reflection on Tom or his firm. It was OVRDC. So,
well, to be fair there, John, when we were wrapping up our broadband work before, the FCC had this big pot of money and they just decided to give it to the telcos rather than go through any sort of process. So I stepped away from broadband too, thinking, well, okay, the FCC's got it. They're handling it. That was back in 2014, 2015. Come back 2020 and go, nope, it's not solved. It's still as bad as it ever was.
Right.
But good. I think we're going to see a sunrise here.
I agree. I think we're on the right path to correct the problem that we have. So appreciate the efforts of those that we have involved, and we'll keep everyone posted as this moves along. Thanks again.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. I'll send out the presentation to your email, and any material that we get or resources we'll try to share out, Tom. So
Yep,
thanks so
that sounds
much,
good.
everyone. Have a great day.